be back this evening. We're thankful to see Joy. She's not feeling her best, but we're happy that she can be with us tonight. We are continuing our study looking at various worldviews, and before I state that, I do need to make a disclaimer. Typically on Wednesday nights, Keith does the Bible study. We're going to be spending about another month or so maybe in the book of Acts that we're currently studying in. Then once Keith is done with that, it's going to go to me. We're going to be studying on the book of Hebrews. We're going to be looking at some of the modern day applications that we need to be able to pull and teach people from that book. More specifically, how the old law is done away with and how the new law is in effect today. And how does the Old Testament relate to the New Testament, and how was the New Testament fulfilled using Old Testament terminology. So the only reason I'm making that disclaimer, go ahead and start reading that book. There is so much in that book. Hopefully we won't spend years on it. We shouldn't. But the way that I go through stuff, it might take years. I'm kidding. It'll be a good study, is what I'm saying. So if you want to prepare yourself, go ahead and read through that book. But as we've been going through various worldviews, we talked about theism last week. And there's a book that came out by Bob Johnson that is called God Gave Us Reason, but Not Religion. And the worldview that we want to talk about tonight is not the idea that I believe there is a God, but there is something that indicates to me that there might be something I could consider and call, well, this must be God, in thought. Hence tonight we're talking about deism, the idea that really there is no absolute God, but we can at least see some evidence that there's some kind of divine being. Now, I don't have verses up here per se, but I want us to get our mind wrapped around this idea as illustrated by Thomas Paine. He would write, "There is happiness in deism when rightly understood, that is not to be found in any other system of religion. All other systems have something in them that either shock our reason or are repugnant." I mispronounced that, to it. "And man, if he thinks at all, must stifle his reason in order to force himself to believe them." What Thomas Paine is saying is that if there is something that violates my sense of reasoning, like women, if you ever see your husband doing the dishes and they never do the dishes, well, that's a shock of reality. What do you mean you're doing the dishes? If there's something that someone says and it gives you that emotional response or thinking in your head, well, maybe I'm wrong or I can't believe that's actually the truth, Thomas Paine would be saying you can't trust that. If it violates your own sense of reasoning, then it must not be trustworthy. When the Bible would tell us quite the opposite, it's not really in us to direct our own steps. Rather, we are to look to God to find direction. But the idea of deism is one that says, okay, you get to decide what's right. And this is going to sound somewhat similar when we talked about the New Age religion, where it's really what I feel and I get to be one with the universe, that type of mentality. That's kind of what deism is. This idea didn't really develop until the late 17th century, early 18th century, where you start having a lot of English and French philosophers and theologians going around saying, you know, there must be something more than just the Bible, or maybe I can come up with a God who doesn't exist, or a God who exists outside of the Bible. And when we look at some of these questions, we're not going through these again, but these are our 8 questions on how we determine what a worldview is. Now, I want to do this differently from how I did it last week. The first part's probably going to be a little boring, but I just want to go through these questions and find out their answers. Then once we get to question 8, before we end the whole thing, I want us to look at the biblical perspective against deism. Because, believe it or not, we do have a lot of people in today's time, though this is an old worldview, we do have people that still carry this idea that God is just a mere thought. And we don't really know how to explain to people, he's not a thought. And we'll get to that once we get to our final core values part. So when we're looking at this idea, the first question to always ask is, what is really real? How do we know what we have is here? Well, their view of God is that you have a God who, and I thought I had a marker, you have a God who at one time existed. And this God, per se, created all of creation. But then after he created the world, he just went away. And he left mankind by himself. And there's always been this gap where mankind is thinking, why am I actually here? Because there's no connection whatsoever between these two beings. And I'm sorry, this is going to be light. But their view is that really God just kind of left us. And he has no interaction with man at all. We talked about last week how it is that God is a personal God. But their view is that God is not a personal God. He has no relationship with you. He's not one who actually could control or at least dictate what's going to happen over a period of time, nor could he even figure out or think himself, what's going to happen 2,000 years from now? Well, I don't really know. Well, I think I'll send my son. And we know how that reasoning would go. Jesus obviously didn't see that he was going to be betrayed. Therefore, God must not be God. And this is where this idea, this line of thinking goes. And he's not sovereign in any regard. So really, it's all left up to man. That is reality. God has separated himself from man, and man is left alone. But how do we determine what is external reality? He would say that the cosmos God created is determined because it's created as a uniformity of cause and effect in a closed system. No miracle is possible. In layman's terms, this is pretty much once God put everything in place and he went away, the same way that 2 Peter 3 would say that from the foundation of the world continues the same way as God originally created it. The deists will take that concept and take it a step further by saying, since God made it that way, it's not changed, and it's just been going on its own ever since God made it. When we can tell that if God made all things, he should be able to have power over the environment. And the deist would say, no, he can't. He left it that way, therefore it's stuck that way. Now, when we start talking about the creation account, if no miracle is possible, this means that the Genesis account now turns into not a literal 6 days, but thousands of years, and that is not what the Bible teaches. But if you claim to be a deist, then you're going to hold that view. What is a human being? Human beings, though personal, are a part of the clockwork of the universe. Since God made all things and he left mankind all by himself to figure things out, that's just part of the process that God came up with. And it almost sounds like, if you recall that first image, it almost sounds like if God put the world into existence and then mankind eventually came out into something, it almost sounds like the idea of evolution. And there are a lot of deists that hold to that idea. Now, with the same token, if we're talking about what a human being is, what happens to a human being at death? Human beings may or may not have a life after their physical existence. Now, something else we have to understand, just like there's going to be very, very conservative Christians, there's also going to be very, very liberal-minded Christians. Same way with deists, we have some people who hold strictly to this concept. However, there are some people, like Benjamin Franklin, who was a deist. He believed there was a resurrection. There is life after this life. And there's a difference between what we call a cold deist, someone who pretty much holds strictly to what their beliefs are, and a warm deist, someone who's a little bit more loose and trying to think more on the outside. And we'll talk about some of those implications when we get to it. So if we know what a human being is and what happens at death, is it really possible to know anything? I'm not going to read this verbatim. But the way they reason through things is that if the scientific method can tell me that it's true, then I believe in the scientific method. If the scientific method shows it to be false, then I cannot believe in the scientific method. And there is a core underlying reasoning that is incorrect in this. You have to be able to ask the deist, how do you know that the scientific method is 100% accurate every single time? What method did scientists have in place before the scientific method even existed? Now, we'll get a little bit more deeper into this once we start evaluating this a little bit more. But the idea is that this world was created perfect and it stayed perfect. There's no such thing as sin. When you get into matters of right or wrong, I get to determine what God is. And God is just this voice in my head. He's not really something that's true. So they don't believe that the world is fallen. 2 more questions and then we'll dive more into the Bible. How do we know what is right and wrong? Ethics is essentially left to me. Since the universe is by itself, it will reveal what is right and what is wrong. Let's think of an interpretation of this. If some human being, if a child backtalks his mom, and the child walks in the road and gets hit by a car, the deist is going to say, he had that coming. You take this into Middle Eastern religions, or Far Eastern religions, they're going to say that's karma. You had it coming. Though karma is not a part of deism, this is the consequence of what they hold. You do something bad, the universe is going to find a way to strike vengeance back at you, when God would say, vengeance is mine. It's not a matter of nature. So the meaning of human history. History is pretty much a set course of actions. If God created all things, and he created man in such a way, the deists will hold the view that God also pre-programmed everything that we're doing. God knew when he made you that he was going to force you somehow to come to the building tonight and sit down and hear a guy ramble about worldviews. That's not necessarily how God works, but the deist is going to say, this is pretty much how it works. God programmed you to do this, therefore it works. And then the consistent core values, and then we'll dive in the Bible. Cold deists use their autonomous reason to determine their goal in life. If I can think it, therefore that's my destiny. Warm deists can reflect on their commitment to a somewhat personal God and determine their goal in accordance to what they believe their God would be pleased with. If I think my own God would be pleased if I fornicated with every single person I came in contact with, so be it. If that's how I view my God, then that must be right. Same thing if I think that stealing is all right. If it pleases me, then it must please my God. And we start mixing up our values of what's right and what's wrong. So if you have your Bible, let's look at a couple passages. If we're talking about the idea of refuting a deist, we need to know at least some passages that we can turn to help someone. The book of 1 Corinthians, though it talks about the idea of unity within the church and division within the church, it also has a brief section in chapter 1 where it talks about the idea of there is a reason why God did what God did. It's not because when God made all things, he separated himself from man, but rather he put things in place in such a intertwined nature that even if man tried to mess up what God made, it would be impossible to do. So God would have dealings with man no matter what mankind would do. Look down at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning in verse 17. Paul would say, "For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words." That's what Paul's really going to emphasize here. What do you mean by wisdom of words? "Lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. For the preaching of the cross to them that perish, foolishness, but to us which are saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent." Where's the wise? Where's the scribe? Where's the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For after that in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. But unto them which are called both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God, and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. The first thing we need to draw from this is when you're talking to someone and you're almost picking up this idea that they don't believe that God is an actual human being. Some chapters that might help. And don't ask them questions the same way that God asked Job questions, but ask them to read Job chapter 38 and 39 and 40 and see if they can answer those same questions that God asked Job. Who is this that darkeneth counsel without knowledge? What do you mean you tell me there is no God? Can you prove that? Because I can prove to you easily, and even some deists would say, you can look around you clearly and see there must be something stronger, more powerful outside of us. And they're absolutely right. You look into some writings of some deists, and they'll say, when you look at the evidence, it is 100% sure that there is some kind of, they'll call it first cause. Something had to start all of this. Well, the Bible tells us exactly who did it, that being God. It's not an idea. It's not some kind of conformed ideas that just kind of synchronized themselves over a period of time. But God said from the very beginning, I've always been there. I was there. And ever since then, I've seen all mankind since then. And I still exist today and will exist forevermore. That's the God of the Bible. Now, when we're looking at that idea that God does exist, you've got to first convince them there is a God. Just look around you. You can use general revelation, which is just creation. You can look at special revelation, whether it's by the words of Christ. Christ said, I'm not a witness of myself, but my Father is a witness of me. Abraham is a witness of me. My works are a witness of me. Moses is a witness. And he keeps mentioning all these things throughout the book of John and the book of Matthew. These things were prophesied, and I came to fulfill all things. I came to bring about peace. I came to give my body and my spirit for the sake of mankind. So if we can prove the idea that there is a God, God does exist. Secondly, we have to make a difference between, what's the difference between the wisdom of man, our intellect, and the wisdom of God? Well, first off, we need to take Isaiah 40's mentality, where his ways are higher than our ways and his understanding higher than our understanding. There will be some things, and we talked about this in our teen class this morning, there are some things that happen in life we will never understand. That doesn't mean that there is no God. That just means that God is so wise and so understanding, well, so not powerful in his understanding, not competent, I can't think of the right word. I can't even describe it. God is so supreme in his understanding that really, if you try to contemplate how exactly it works, it's just going to drive you crazy because you don't get it. Now, hold your finger at 1 Corinthians and look over at Psalm chapter 73. Psalm chapter 73. And I think we've looked at this text before. But David takes this idea is that I've gone through all of these trials and these struggles, and I've seen these people who say that there is no knowledge in the Most High. Now, what David is about to do here, he's about to describe the mentality of these people. He would say in verse, we'll just begin in verse 1. He begins the argument by saying, truly God is good to Israel, even to such as are of a clean heart. And he starts reflecting on his own past. But as for me, my feet were almost gone. My steps had well nigh slipped. For I was envious at the foolish when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For there are no bands in their death, but their strength is firm. They are not in trouble as other men, neither are they plagued like other men. Therefore pride compasseth them about as a chain. Violence covereth them as a garment. Now pause right there. If I hold the view that I get to determine what is right and what is wrong, and I also get to determine, I don't think it's on this page, that whatever happens to me is a consequence of the universe, then I might be thinking here when I'm reading this in verse 5, they are not troubled as other men. Obviously, whoever made all of creation must have some kind of special interest towards this person, because all they get is all these good things in life. And this almost sounds like the same reasoning that Job's friends had. Well, obviously you had to sin, otherwise God wouldn't be punishing you. Well, obviously God must like you because he's rewarding you, is some people's mentality. And that's what David is drawing right here. These are people who it seems like good things are happening to them. But really, when you look at their core values of their heart in verse 6, their pride binds them as a chain, and their actions are just full of violence. Continuing in verse 7, their eyes stand out with fatness. They had more than their heart could wish. They are corrupt and speak wickedly concerning oppression, and they speak loftily. They set their mouth against the heavens, and their tongue walketh through the earth. Now pause right there. You put this in contrast with Psalm chapter 19, where the heavens and the earth declare the glory of the Lord. If creation declares God's glory, and the wicked man contends against what creation proclaims, who's right? Is it the things that are the byproduct, what God made? Or is it the thing which God created in His image, who assumes that He must know all things because He can determine His actions and all that? David's going to say, these are corrupt people. These are people that you shouldn't be listening to. This same idea he continues in verse 10. Therefore his people return hither, and waters of a full cup are wrung out to them. And they say, how doth God know? Again, God is a concept. How can God know if He's not really there, is what they're saying. How can God know, and is there knowledge in the Most High? Behold, these are the ungodly who prosper in the world and increase in riches. And verily I've cleansed my heart in vain and washed my hands in innocency. For all the day long I have been plagued and chastened every morning. If I say, I will speak thus, behold, I should offend against the generation of thy children. When I thought to know this, it was too painful for me. Until I went into the sanctuary of God, then understood I therein. I don't know how, well, I can look and see. Some of you wear glasses. Some of us do, well, I'm pretty sure I'm one of the few people in here right now not wearing glasses, so I'm speaking to the multitude now. If you don't have the right kind of prescription glasses, you're not going to be able to see very clearly. If you're wearing far-sighted glasses and you're nearsighted, it's really going to mess you up. If you're nearsighted but you're given far-sighted glasses, that's going to mess you up too. It's not going to fix where your problem is. Now, let's take that into a biblical example. When I view the world through my own eyes, and I determine what is right, what is wrong, what I consider to be God and biblical in my terms, am I actually going to have a correct view of the world? No, I'm not. The deist is going to claim the opposite. Yes, I will have a good view of the world. However, what David says here in verse 17, until I put on the right prescription of glasses. Once I did that and I saw things the way that God defined them and described them, I didn't understand where they were going in their life. But now that I'm looking at things through the right prescription, I know their end. Their end is destruction. Even if they do receive good things in life, it's not a good end for them, at least through God's prescription. Now, he would say here in verse 18, he's continuing to define what happens here. Surely thou didst set them in slippery places. Thou casteth them down into destruction. How are they brought into desolation, as in a moment they are utterly consumed with terrors? David really gets a broad picture here. The same way we need to be able to open the eyes of our friends who claim this idea. Do you really understand the consequence of your view if you claim that you can be right in one thing, and this person over here says that they're right, but it contrasts with what you're saying? Both of you claim to be right. For example, abortion's right, abortion's wrong. You both can't be right. If that is a moral issue, an objective moral issue, there must be something that tells me that killing a young child is right or killing a young child is wrong. Thankfully, God told us the answer. But the deist is going to try to have to resolve in their mind, okay, maybe everybody can't be right. If we can get our friend on that page, then we've got them in a good place. Now, going back to the concept of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, true wisdom is that which God is going to prescribe, as we already talked about from Psalm 73. But I want you to look at these responses when it comes to the Jews, God's chosen people, and the Greeks, the people who God would eventually graft in if they decided to be obedient. When he would say here in verse 22 of 1 Corinthians 1, for the Jews require a sign. The prophets of old time could do miracles. Why the Messiah should be able to do these miracles? Jesus did these miracles. The Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. Did you know that God is so knowing and so prepared to deal with these things that he made a way for both parties to be completely satisfied with the evidence that he set forward? If you're looking for miracles, let me send you my son. Let me send you the apostles. Let me show you all these good works that can take place. If you're seeking after wisdom, look at Acts 17, where Paul would say, "Ye men of Athens, I declare that you are superstitious. But let me declare unto you this God, this unknown God, in whom we move and have our very being," as he quotes through the poets. And he says, if you really want to know wisdom, you need to look more into the God that really you know nothing about, which is the problem that our deist friend is going to have. They're creating an idea of God that is not the biblical concept of God. And I try to stress this to every single person that I talk to, whether they are a Christian or they're not a Christian. If you have a problem with God and say God is unfair in some way, or God is not loving in some way, or God just doesn't know all things, I stop them right there and say, now the Bible tells me that's not the God of the Bible. I don't know what God you have a problem with, but it's not with the God of the Bible. So we need to be asking them, how would you define or describe God? Because if it doesn't fit all the criteria of the Bible, then your issue's not with God Almighty, but rather it's your concept of who you think God is. So even the deist is going to be at conflict with him or herself, that God is not really fit up to all that I can be. We look at Acts chapter 12, where Herod took praise of the people, and the people would say it's the voice of a God and not of a man. And Herod was smitten by worms. Interesting story, but I think that's the same idea when we deem that we are God ourselves. Now, God's not going to necessarily strike us with worms, but he does say that that is a slippery road to go down. Actually, it's downright dirty, so to speak. But it's not with us to determine who is God and who is not. If God has already showed us through his word, at least looking at creation, he's already showed us that the evidence is there. So really those three things, where we're looking at the idea of what is morally right and morally wrong, the deist has to be able to explain what is right objectively and what is wrong objectively. It is a fact right, it is a fact wrong. They also have to defend themselves. How can I know who God is? And if they say it's a byproduct of their thought, well, you just told me that you determining right or wrong and someone else who may have a conflicting view of what's right or wrong, if they conflict, then obviously you don't get to determine what's right or wrong. So how can I tell that your God is right and mine is wrong? They have to be able to cope with that too. Thirdly, they have to be able to cope with the idea that everything that happens is not a byproduct of the universe was designed this way. The universe, if they can describe to you the everyday dealings, same way that God would talk to Job, if they can describe how the sophisticated complex systems that God has put in place works, then they probably have a good start on how to determine how, what's the right word? How providence works, how choices work, how your actions and the consequences of those actions work. The same way you throw a rock into a pool or a pond and it makes all these ripples. You should be able to determine or tell me how this person's going to react to this, how this person's going to react to this, and this person's going to react to this, what all the positive consequences are of your actions and the negative consequences of your actions. They're not going to be able to do it, and more than likely they're going to get very angry. But we're not trying to make them angry. We want them to see the consequence of their worldview. Because if they can't answer this, then why are they holding on to it? And even we as Christians, if we're not able to give an answer for the reason of hope that is within us, we're failing as Christians. We have to be able to give a defense for our worldview just as much as someone who does not believe in the biblical worldview. We have to be able to be on the same page. If we're completely honest with them, they have to be able to be completely honest with us. So the idea, at least tonight, is the idea of if there really is a God, is he really a matter based on reason alone? No. It's not. Rather, it's a matter of reason and revelation. Hence, we have the Bible. Now, as we continue this study, we'll be looking more into views that are without God. And we're probably going to combine a lot of those worldviews together because they share a lot of similar concepts. But the Bible would speak about people who have this idea that there is no God. We might look at the verse that the fool has said in his heart there is no God, someone who just point blank denies the evidence. But if a deist is one who claims that I can be rational, I can be reasonable, then they have to be able to take the evidence that you give them, reason correctly, and determine whether or not can I hold on to this view. If they're honest, they can't. But if they're not being honest, they're going to hold on to it with their entire being. And just like David would say in Psalm 73, their path is a slippery slope, and it leads to destruction. We have to be able to be like Paul, be all things to all men, be able to not necessarily understand every single concept, but be able to reason with other people so that we can see where they're coming from and help lead them into the path. You recall the way that the psalmist would write in Psalm 23, where the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, and he leadeth me, he maketh me to lie down in green pastures. There's this imagery of a sheep being forced in a certain direction. Sometime with our own reasoning, even with our friends, we need to help lead them in the right direction. If it is the case tonight that maybe your reasoning is the only thing you think through, you don't take God's revelation for credit, you don't even give God credit for creating the universe. He's just a concept or an idea. I would encourage you, talk to someone. Talk to a member of the body of Christ. Talk to me. Talk to anyone who claims that they read their Bible. If you read the Bible enough, you'll find out God has left enough evidence in His book to determine, okay, this is actually truth. This was revealed by an inspired source. And if you need that help, then we can sit down and study through those things and consider the evidence. As it would say in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18, come, let us reason together. If we're unwilling to come together to reason, then we're just defeating our purpose. We're willing to stay within darkness, ignorance, rather than learn how to understand. If you're not a child of God tonight, and maybe you've been living your life just through reason, I think it's right, I think it's wrong, but then again, you find something interesting that catches your eye about God's Word. The message which it presents through God's Son, Jesus Christ, who came to this earth and came and died for you so that you could have eternal life. You could have remission of sins. If you build your faith and truly believe, you place that faith, establish it in the teachings of Christ and who Christ is, and you establish it within the will that God defines through the Bible. You believe those things, you're willing to repent and confess Christ before all men and be baptized so that you can become a child of God. You've considered the evidence, you've reasoned critically, and now that you become a child of God, you must live faithful to the end so that you can receive that crown of life. If you find yourself stuck between two opinions, how long will you be stuck? If you need any help or the prayers of the church tonight, we ask that you please come forward as together we stand and we sing.